welcome to the second event of 2020 to 2021 from the Nottingham Creative Writing Hub at Nottingham Trent University. Tonight we'll be with Pete Paphides, and I, for one, am very excited about that. I'm Rory Waterman. I'm a member of academic staff at NTU, and I convene the Nottingham Creative Writing Hub. And the hub represents the staff and students in creative writing at NTU, where we have thriving creative writing programs at BA, MA and PhD levels, and some amazing staff too, including my friend and colleague, the novelist Eve Makis, who's chairing tonight's event. The hub website is very easy to find. Just go to www.nottinghamcreativewritinghub.com, and there you'll find a varied blog, members profiles, and our programme of forthcoming events, among other things. All our events are free to attend, and if you follow us on Twitter at Hub Nottingham, you'll always be notified when registration for an event opens. And I've put the links in the chat so that all of you can take them down if you want to do so. The Nottingham Creative Writing Hub isn't made by any individuals. It's made by a writing community of students and staff, supported by a faculty at NTU that believes in the power of writing and ideas. Creative writing has been important at NTU for nearly 3 decades, and the community is very strong. The hub events are for that community, but they're also open to the public. And all of them are supported by our students. And tonight, in addition to Eve and Pete, we're going to be joined by one of our outstanding Midlands4Cities-funded PhD candidates, Hannah Cooper-Smithson, who's also a star graduate of our MA Creative Writing and a very fine writer. If you have any questions during the night, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and add them in there whenever you like, and hopefully Eve will be able to get to quite a few of them. But now I'm going to shut up and pass to Eve, and I hope everybody enjoys the event. Over to you, Eve. You're muted, Eve.
Okay, sorry. Am I unmuted now?
Yeah. It's just the way it goes for all of us.
Thank you. Okay. Sorry about that. I just wanted to say thank you to Pete for agreeing to speak to us at Nottingham Creative Writing Hub.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me.
And I'd like to say thank you to everybody who's come along. And I know that we've got an international audience tonight. There are some people from Cyprus. You might be interested to know, Pete. So, and just to reiterate, there is a button, there's a Q&A button at the bottom. Please type in some questions that you'd like me to ask Pete, and I will do that at the end of our talk. I'm going to mention something about your career for people who don't know. You've worked for, you were the rock critic for the Times for many years. You've worked for The Guardian, for Melody Maker, Time Out and other publications. And you recently released this beautiful memoir called Broken Greek, in which you tell the story of your childhood in the 70s and 80s through pop music, popular culture and cultural experiences that shaped you. I mean, is that sort of fair, succinct description of the book?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So the first question I'd like to ask you is, you are primarily a journalist and broadcaster, and I've heard actually lots of your stuff on Radio 4. What made you decide to write a memoir?
I wanted to write I thought, you know, my feeling about the way we that we kind of grow up as people who, you know, we all have music in our lives, we all need music in our lives, and you know, it occurred to me that the way, I think, you know, the reason I loved the music that I loved increasingly, if I had to sort of explain why I loved records that I loved as a kid, you know, I sort of found that I found it really hard to do so in an honest way without referencing things that were happening in my life. And I think that's actually me, that's actually how, and yet here's music journalism is this thing that has kind of gone, you know, this has its own traditions for decades and decades and decades. And it tends not to, you know, people who write about music often tend to kind of observe a separation between the way we live our lives and the way we experience music. And I'm not sure that that's altogether possible to do so in an honest way. And so I wanted to write a childhood memoir about, I wanted to write about, I wanted to celebrate that music, and I wanted to celebrate it in the context of how that music, when you're very young, I think the records you love them because they sort of, in a way, they're kind of explaining your situation to you. And I think that might even be truer for people who grow up to parents who were raised by parents who grew up in a different environment to them, so second generation immigrants, because you know, you are ultimately turning into a person who's going to be very different. We're all different to our parents anyway, but I think that really is accentuated when you grow up. You know, in my case, I was growing up in Birmingham here in England, and my parents grew up in Greece and Cyprus, respectively. My mum was Greek, my dad was Cypriot, and I realised I was turning into something very different. And actually, I think I was probably turning into something they didn't want me to turn into, and that made me feel guilty. And you know, pop music was the driver, the engine of that realisation. And in my case, the guilt was compounded by the fact that, you know, I had certain sort of social problems. We were going to move to Cyprus when I was 4. That didn't happen in the end because the island was partitioned, and the place we were going to move to, my dad's hometown, was now under Turkish occupation. And it was dangerous to do that, so we stayed here. And the longer we stayed here, the more British I felt, the more I felt the need to fit in. And so their dream was slipping away from them, and at some level I was aware of that. And because for 3 years the sort of the discombobulation from that, I think, led to me not talking to anyone outside of my family for 3 years. I was what is now, I think, selective mute, I think is the term that's used now.
So what you were dealing with, sort of the confusion or maybe the disappointment of not going, because you talk in the book about the time that you spent in Cyprus being quite idyllic actually when you were a child, and it's the place that you wanted to be, and then you came back to sort of cold, foggy England and got thrown into school. And sort of, was it the shock of that and the confusion that made you sort of stop speaking, perhaps? I mean, I guess you don't know, but
that was a lot to do with it, and just the sudden kind of shock, and I remember being suddenly quite scared of everything, and just sort of, I didn't really have the words to articulate it to myself at the time, but a feeling that I'd become something very different, that I couldn't be. There was like an idealized child that existed out there, and I could never be that child. They would probably.
I think maybe we've all sort of felt that within sort of Greek Cypriot families. Like,
really,
I'm not. Oh yeah, absolutely. I was going to get to that. I'm going to get to that a bit later, if you don't mind, because you know, for me that's really interesting. It's partly what attracted me to your book, because we've got a very, very similar background. I'm going to sort of tell you about that in a bit, but if I could take you back to the sort of writing process, because you didn't quite answer my question. What made you move from journalism to memoir writing? Was it a sudden decision? Was it something that, I actually know the answer to this question, but I think the audience might be interested, because I've heard you talk about it, but was it a sudden decision? Was it something that came over time? Did you have lots of writing that you'd done that you thought this would fit into sort of a memoir?
There were different impulses. There wasn't one reason. There were different reasons. One of them was that the kind of the game was increasingly up for music journalism. I think, you know, the gatekeeper is no longer needed in the way that it maybe was in a pre-streaming era, and so you know, the job of actually describing records is becoming obsolete because people can just go on Spotify and listen to something before they spend their money on it. So I think music writing has to become more personal anyway. It has to do a different job to what it did before, because the conversation around music has changed. And we all want to read, we all want to go and read something that celebrates great music. So I don't think that will change, but I think that's a sort of tectonic shift.
Well, that's really interesting, and it sort of chimes with sort of the message that I try and put across to writers, and that's that they've got to be flexible. You've got to try different sorts of writings, especially if you want to make a living.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that sort of you've confirmed that in what you've said, and you can turn your hand to other things. It's a learning curve. Did you feel that writing the memoir was a learning curve for you?
Yeah, I didn't know if I could do it at all. I had no idea, and I thought, you know, there are certain, you know, over time I had certain kind of set pieces, if you like, in my head, which I thought if I could find a suitable context in which to, they're all recollections, they're all things that had happened to me. And so for me, writing the book was like a kind of very blurred picture slowly coming into focus. And
but you've got a framing device for the memoir. I mean, the hook, you know, from what I've read, and is about the fact that you're this child who stopped speaking and found refuge in
and I knew from like day one, music. Yeah, and I knew from day one what the opening page was going to be.
Well, I was going to ask you that, because I mean, I really like your opening page, and I like the reference that you make to your brother as well. No, that's before. Is that before that he sort of paved the way for your life to be a bit easier?
Yeah. That was in the little intro at the beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, those were other motivations for writing the book. The book is kind of a love letter to different people who, you know, had a hugely beneficial influence to my life, and also to my parents who didn't get to finish off what they started. They wanted to go back to Cyprus and they couldn't because, you know, me and my brother became too attached to this place.
Yeah,
and we're still here.
That's the story of almost every Cypriot that I know. So it's, and some went back and were disappointed, some went back and came back. You know, it's
my dad is constantly shuttling back and forth between Cyprus and this country because he doesn't quite feel at home in either place. And it's just something he just doesn't quite seem to be able to resolve. And my brother, who, you know, he was just so helpful. And so we'll come back to my brother, but I think but yeah, the opening page of the book, I'm here, I'm being led up the steps to this this place, this specialist who is gonna, you know, I am now a problem child. I won't talk, you know, seemingly the authorities are concerned. Why do children stop talking? Well, sometimes the reasons can be very dark. Who knows? They don't know. So I'm being, you know, and obviously, and you know, Eve, you'll know this, I think, you know, there's a huge pressure, certainly within Cypriot and maybe to a slightly lesser degree, possibly Greek families, to produce children that are not problematic. You know, the kind of the phone call where you're on the phone to the relative in Cyprus and you're boasting really about all the great things that have happened in your family since the last phone call. And then if something terrible has happened in another branch of the family, then you pick it apart for ages. And, you know, I would overhear these phone calls between my parents and relatives in Cyprus that to me sounded a bit like Schadenfreude. You know, they purported to be kind of concerned. I'm sure at some level they were concerned and compassion and all that. But, you know, they really, you know, if one of someone's kids was arrested or something, or they did something weird, or they dropped out of something, then they'd suddenly brought shame upon the family. So the concept of shame upon the family, I think, is really hardwired into Cypriots. I think maybe more than a lot of other.
I think you certainly had a lot of material to play with within that short span of your childhood that you were writing about. I think using music as a vehicle for the story is a great way to tell your story, because you don't have to be obsessed with music to be affected by it.
No.
Music is a trigger to memories, isn't it? It takes you back almost immediately to the way you felt about something, or it resurrects. I wanted to ask if you listened to your old tracks when you were writing this, and whether they brought back memories.
Yeah, constantly. It was wonderful, because it was, I could almost allow myself, I had a creative excuse to wallow in all this stuff. And and music is you get that, it is like a record that you loved even at the age of 6. It's like a time machine. You're just parachuted into this situation that you're just there. You're that kid again. I was the kid in the phone box listening to, phoning up the rotary dial for dial-a-disc, and here.
Yeah, so actually, let me stop you there, because that will sound to our probably younger audience absolutely prehistoric. So you used to stand in a telephone box.
Yeah, there was a
music.
Yeah, there was a service.
Could you explain what dial-a-disc was then?
Yeah, I will. Yeah, there was a service called Dial-a-Disc, which was run by British Telecom, as it was then. So in the days before mobile phones and the internet, if you wanted to know someone's phone number, there was a big thick book called the telephone directory, and you got a new one every year. And then at the front of the telephone directory, there was a list of important phone numbers. And so you'd have the operator, you'd have the emergency services, 999, obviously, you'd have the weather, you'd have the speaking clock. And just to give you an idea of how valuable music was, because music, you couldn't get Spotify, you couldn't get music on demand in those days. So that pushed the value of music concomitantly upwards. And just to give you an idea of how valuable music was, there was, amongst all these lists of emergency necessary services, excuse me, was Dial-a-Disc. And you rang a 3-digit number and to listen to a record, not one that you could choose, just a record chosen by these guys that was in the charts, that was in the top 10 that week. And as a treat, my mum would kind of give me some coins, and we go to the telephone box outside our fish and chip shop where we grew up, and I'd stand there and I'd listen on the other end of a phone receiver to just a song, and it was it was thrilling, and so you'd have these very dramatic, visceral introductions to these records. So like I remember hearing like Sugar Baby Love by a group called the Rubettes, or I Love to Love by Tina Charles. Of course you'd hear these things, and often it would be the first time you'd hear these songs, so you would know nothing about this person. You wouldn't have a picture of the person that did the song, you wouldn't know their name. It would just be this kind of metaphysical presence being piped into your brain, and you would just be in another, it would release your imagination in some kind of weird way. And so
we've got one of our panelists saying that's a very familiar. And I know this particular panelist personally, Zoe Bibonidis. She's from Cyprus, and not only is she from Cyprus, but she's from Acox Green.
Oh, really? Maybe
you might have met. You might even be related. You never know.
Yeah.
So if I could move you on to some quick fire questions.
Sure.
How long did the memoir take to write, from start to finish?
The first draft from beginning to end took almost exactly 2 years, and then I didn't show it to. I showed it to very few people. I didn't try and find a publisher in that time, because I realized very early on that my idea was unpitchable. It was a messy idea. It wasn't one thing or the other. It was a memoir, but it was also a book about music history in a particular time frame. And although I knew in my head how I was going to interweave those two strands, I also knew that if I attempted to explain it to a publisher and try and get an advance for it, the atmosphere in the room would be kind of awkward. I didn't think I could do a good job of that. And also I knew it was going to be a long book. And, in the general scheme of things, no one really knows who I am. So why on earth would you want to take a chance on a big thick book, which is about two things, all kind of smooshed together by a writer that most people haven't heard of. So I knew that, you know, there was no way that, you know, it was, I was on a sticky wicket. So I wrote the book, and then I had an agent, and I kind of knew which publisher I was going to send it to, because there was a publisher called an editor called Katie Follane, who had been at various publishing houses over the last 20 years. About 20 years ago, she approached me and said, one day I think you're going to write a book, and when I do, I'd like to be the first person to see that.
Oh, wow.
So I never forgot.
That's not something you forget, is it, when an agent says that to you?
No, because I didn't think, for the vast majority of those years, I didn't think I was capable of writing a book. I thought I'd go mad if I tried to write a book.
Yeah.
And so so I thought, well, whatever happens.
Can I stop you there? You said you thought you'd go mad. Is that because of the? Do you mind me saying that you're married to Caitlin Moran, who's famous columnist? She's written. In fact, I've got a book right here on my desk, How to Be a Woman.
Yeah.
And more recently, the screenplay for How to Build a Girl.
Build a Girl, yeah.
Yeah. So, is that part? Did that intimidate you at all, that you knew what the process was like and how intensive it was? Because, or is it that you?
Caitlin's a bit of an exception to the rule. Caitlin, of all the people I know who write, she's the one that she works at such a velocity, and her, you know, she has self-doubt in all sorts of ways, but her self-doubt as a writer there's really not much there. You know, she knows. She's been writing since she was a child, so she and quite right, she's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
And she so no, it wasn't intimidating. I thought, you know, I knew that there was a potential for embarrassment if the book came out and people thought it was shit, and and then you know, people might be like, oh, okay, who does he think he is? He thinks, like, just because like his wife kind of knocks them out and they're brilliant, does he think he can do it as well? But so
yeah.
there was a sort of potential for embarrassment, but to be honest, you know, it's what I do is so different to what she does. It's, you know, I could just be, it could be a book about stamp collecting for all the kind of like similarity.
Could I ask, living with another writer, do you liaise with each other? Do you edit each other's? Do you read each other's work, or is it? Do you sort of have your separate?
We used to. I'm a lot more insecure than she is, so I used to sometimes show her pieces and just say, "Is this rubbish?" I don't do that anymore. I don't know why. You know what? I think the book, actually, I knew I wasn't going to show her the book until it was finished. Because if she thought it was rubbish, if I was like halfway through and I showed her, so, well, look, this is what I've been up to, and she didn't quite get it, then it would have been a bit too embarrassing for both of us.
I think that's good advice, actually, because a lot of writers, a lot of young writers, maybe not. I don't think age matters necessarily, but when you're working on something, you want validation, don't you? You want to know it's a good or okay, so you can carry on. And sometimes the best way is not to show anybody until you're sort of quite, because it can dampen your confidence, and it can stop you in your tracks or make you go off track. And sometimes it's just best to sort of beaver away until you're finished, have self-belief, and then show it to someone who knows what they're talking about, rather than show it to your mom who's going to tell you it's great and it might not be.
There was one person I showed it to, my friend Bob, who's also a writer, and he's a musician. He's in the group Saint Etienne, and we're very close friends, and I love his writing, and because there's a kind of musical aspect to the book, I thought he'd kind of have a pretty good handle on what I was trying to do. And so I would occasionally send him bits, and I said, you know, he was the first person, I think, to read the whole thing all the way through, and I was a bit worried that, you know, that no publisher was going to publish it at that length. And he was great. He just said, you know, I just think the book has to exist at this length, and if someone cuts it in half, then they're not the right publisher for you. You know, there's not. And I'm so glad he said that, because it made me feel a bit braver when we finally sent it to Katie, who ultimately published it for Quercus. And you know, God, it was, I mean, the best feeling in the world when the news came through, because that could have been really embarrassing. Imagine, like, okay, you've taken someone, you know, you take someone out for lunch in 2002 or whenever it was, and you say, I think you're going to write a book one day, and when the time comes, I want to be the first person to see it. And then, you know, then, like, you know, 17 years later or whatever it is, you know, you send them the book and it's not very good. How embarrassing would that have been, you know? So but thankfully,
so it all turned out very well for you.
Well, yeah, God, I mean,
yeah,
God,
yeah.
thankfully she liked it, you know. And she was and so I said, I got the phone call came via my agent. I said to my agent, but what about the length of it? Does she actually want the whole thing? Because we didn't know if anyone would be brave enough to publish it at that length. And she said, yes, she says she just wants to make a feature of it, because that's just the story. She doesn't know what you really cut. So I was like, you know, God, I couldn't, you know, it was like you know, I felt like a competition winner, but really a winner of the only competition I would have ever wanted to enter in my life, really. So yeah.
Okay, can I take you slightly along a different route now? We've got a few questions coming in as well, which is great. Thank you for your questions. I will ask them in a sec. So one of the reasons that I was drawn to your book is the fact that we have very similar, if not almost identical, childhoods. So my first novel, the first novel I wrote, was about a Greek Cypriot girl wanting to escape the family fish and chip shop by going to university, wow, which was essentially my life. And as I read your memoir, I found other very surprising similarities.
Yeah.
So my father, like yours, landed at Snow Hill Station in Birmingham when he arrived.
Wow.
He, you know, searching for a better life, and he worked as a mechanical engineer. Wow. At a car company in Lucas's, actually.
Lucas, wow,
Lucas's.
My house, yeah.
And then, because he couldn't get promoted because he was Cypriot, even though he'd passed the exams, he was helped by a friend to buy a fish and chip shop. So it's sort of very similar to your story, your dad's story. And my father spent his first night in a telephone box with £5 in his pocket. And was, I don't know if your dad mentioned this, but he said on the guest house signs, there were, you know, no Irish, no dogs, and no Cypriots. So it's you know, it's an uncomfortable truth.
So he said that he spent the first night in a telephone box, like just for sheltering. Do you mean?
Yeah. Because he didn't know where to go. I think quite a few Cypriots landed in Birmingham at Snow Hill Station because somebody just told them to go to Snow Hill Station, and they just headed there. And so I'm leading to somewhere else. So I think that knowing their stories is really important, because it makes you sort of understand the mistakes that they made, because I think they all made mistakes with their children, but you have to see those mistakes through the prism of what they went through. Oh yeah. And I wanted to read a section from your book which makes that point, which sort of really struck me. And this is taken from a section where your mother was taken to hospital. She had a hysterectomy, and your father went to visit her in the hospital and basically couldn't show any sympathy. And at the time, I think you were really angry about it. And then you write this in the book. It does no good to weight memories with the knowledge of what ought to have happened. That doesn't teach you anything. It merely reinforces what you felt at the time. What helps is to go back to the scene and try and ask yourself why everyone assumed the roles they did. What was it about my dad that meant he could look at my mother in her condition and park any visible concern in order to tell her what her operation meant for him over the next fortnight or so? Was it that he didn't care? Was he trying to guilt trip her? At the age of 11, that was exactly how it seemed to me. And now I think he was scared. I thought that was really poignant.
Thank you.
And I was wondering whether you felt that writing the memoir gave you a sort of greater understanding of your parents.
Yeah.
If I could just briefly mention my first book, when I started writing, it was a bitter tirade against the injustices of not being able to wear Doc Martens and have boyfriends, and basically being this repressed Greek Cypriot female. But as I started to think more about my parents, and I delved into their history, and I talked to them about their past, and I discovered all these stories that all these terrible things that my dad went through, like, you know, protection rackets and at the shop, and I mean, awful stories. It sort of made me see them in a different light.
Yeah.
And it made me see the world through their eyes and actually turn the book. It's only when I established that distance from my own story and was able to see through their eyes that the book really started to work. It became a satire. It was a comedy in the end, because I think we've got to laugh about these. There's so much humor and comedy in our culture. It's unbelievable. Totally. So I just wanted to ask whether you found, did the book, I don't know, was it cathartic? Did it, were you sort of, or have you dealt with all of that because you
well, I think you have to, you sort of deal with a lot of it before you start writing it. And, it would have been a very different book if I tried to write it 20 years ago. I'm really glad I didn't try and write it 20 years ago. It takes you a long time to kind of figure out, it helps that I'm a parent, and, and that I think the thing about when you become a parent, you realize everything's up for grabs, everything's at stake, because your children are not yet adults, and you don't really know how it's going to go. And I see, so when I think about my parents, they're being maybe a bit overprotective at times, or just sort of thinking that as long as, like, we marry Greek women, or or kind of do certain kinds of jobs, then the potential perils that might lay ahead might be reduced. I sort of get all that now, but because you don't know it, every child you bring up is an experiment in a way. You don't know how it's going to end. And so I can sort of see why they were, overprotective at times, or sort of a bit, treated, fairly minor incidents like they full on kind of thermonuclear sort of, cataclysms. Now it's kind of leveled out a bit, because I'm 51. I'm not living on, I'm not sleeping in a ditch on the embankment tonight, it's whatever decisions were made, we're all basically sort of okay. So you get that.
You turned out okay in the end.
So certainly it's better than maybe it looked like I was going to at certain times. And so
can I read another line?
I married an English woman, and the world didn't end, and she's brilliant.
So you say you married an Englishwoman. You see, my mum used to say, if you marry an Englishman, I'm going to jump off Trent Bridge. She used to say that all the time. So and meant it. I mean, I put it in the book because it was really funny, but it wasn't funny when she was saying that. So I married a Cypriot man against my own expectations,
right.
But they didn't like him either. So it didn't always work out that if you followed what they wanted, then they'd like that anyway.
And sometimes and sometimes you just have to sort of, sadly, you have to do, you have to lay down boundaries in the same way that you have to with children, and say, look, this is just going to have this is how we're going to do things, and it's going to be fine, don't worry. And that's kind of, that's okay,
So can I just read one more line again? It's sort of, there's I found lots of bits that I found really sort of insightful, where you'd sort of cut to the core of things, and I don't think that's easy. I think you've got to spend a lot of time thinking about things to come out with these lines. So I love this line. I've spent more hours in total standing in front of the chiller cabinet in Marks and Spencer's choosing my dinner than my parents did deciding where to emigrate. I thought that was a great line.
Yeah, the point being that, you know, there was there was less information available. You couldn't just kind of go online endlessly and scope out, you know, the kind of pros and cons of what you might do next. You just, everything was unknown. You had to take a leap of faith, and things that were, you know, there was a general belief in, certainly in Greece and Cyprus at that time, that, you know, if you could just get yourself over to the UK, you know, you could probably, like, you know, get a job that earned you quite a bit of money in quite a few short space of time, and then you'd have enough to kind of lay down roots, and you know, maybe, you know, for when you kind of spent the rest of your life in Cyprus. And obviously that we now know that that was quite a naive sort of belief to have, not least because you don't really factor in your you know, where your kids might want to live and how that might affect them. I mean, those bits with the bit you read out earlier on, where, you know, my dad visits my mum in hospital, I really agonized over those bits because I really didn't want to sort of seem disrespectful or harsh, and I really you know, it was really I wrote it and I rewrote it, and I just wanted, you know, and I was scared about what they might think when it came out, and but actually they were, much to my relief, they were fine with it. And my dad sort of got it, you know, he kind of understood, you know, what the point I was trying to make, thankfully.
Yeah, well, I think you did qualify it anyway. You know, you sort of, you've processed it, and it is, like you say, it's a celebration of your parents. We all make mistakes, don't we? All parents make mistakes.
And, you know, and it's hard, you know, again, I mean, that line about, you know, it doesn't do you any good to freight you know, certain memories with you know, whatever feelings you might have had at the time. And I think the other thing to remember is we're all a little bit, you know, enlightened than we were back then. And, you know, even a relatively enlightened Cypriot man back then, by today's standards, wasn't really that enlightened. And, you know, these men were not raised to sort of analyze their emotions and to separate, you know, the need they had for their wives from love, and, you know, the way they didn't know how to express love a lot of the time in the way that, you know, men are expected to express it now. And so I didn't really want to be too judgmental about that stuff. Yeah. I wanted to put that into context.
Okay, so we're coming close to the end now. So I might not need you to do a reading, but I just wanted to ask you. I was listening to your wife on Late Night Woman's Hour.
Yeah.
And she was referring to people who sort of came up to her and asked her, how do I write a book, or how should I write a book? And she said something like, if you knew you had 3 weeks to live and didn't want to spend them writing a book, then you're probably not a writer. She said, which I thought was great, the best way to write a book is by pretending you're being chased by a beast. Which leads me to my next question, and that is, did the threat of the chip shop, the family business, was that your beast? Is that what got you where you were?
It was for a lot, you know, a lot of the time. I mean, that, and the fact that I just sort of knew there was a sort of version of adulthood that my parents kind of wanted for me, that I knew I was incapable of living, and you know, chip shops possibly involved with it, and, you know, and so
I just thought, you know, some people don't have anything to run away. Maybe it's been a good thing, because some people don't have anything to escape from, and maybe they don't run so fast.
Yeah, one thing about writing the book, you know, I realized when I was writing actually just how many things I was scared of. So, you know, because some things that might, you know, were quite trivial, like, you know, I understand now what it was that terrified me about little Jimmy Osmond. Every time I saw him on the television, I noticed that Helen Barrett has brought up Jimmy Osmond there. you know, he was the child that I somehow thought I was supposed to be, and so I would scurry behind the sofa and start crying every time I saw him. And you know, there was just also I just couldn't I mean, part of what the book's about really, and the music really, you know, was the proxy space in which a lot of those worries were kind of decanted into. Was just, I couldn't for the life of me figure out what vacancy there was waiting for me in adulthood. And you know, I think a lot of that's kind of childhood, isn't it? There's nothing unique about that. We all feel that to a certain degree. And I sort of think that
I think their other influence on me is the work ethic that I saw with my parents. Like, I employed that work ethic in my own profession. You know, I never stop, and I just wonder where it comes from. And I think it comes partly from them. You know, I don't.
We can track it. I've noticed our children are a little bit like that as well. And
my daughter is like that. She's 22, and she feels guilty if she's not working or she's not productive.
That's not good. And I try and sort of condition myself to try and be a bit less like that. But I do think, you know, I think the one thing that I hope the book, you know, there's a few things that I hope the book might have succeeded at doing. I think, you know, it's very easy to forget, you know, especially these days, you know, we're so horrible to Generation Zers and millennials, and we're so dismissive. I don't know where this came from, you know, that like somehow, you know, the you know, calling them snowflakes and all that sort of stuff. That's just so nasty. You know, how could we have forgotten how even in relatively stable periods, how onerous the prospect is, you know, of being, you know, metaphorically, you're that wildebeest, the migrating wildebeest in the nature documentary, and you have to get across that river to your adult self. And the only way to do it is to fucking just go for it. And, you know, and there are kind of cheetahs and tigers trying to eat you alive, and you've just got to get there. And you know, these days more than ever, you know, it's harder to get on the kind of property ladder, and you know, and tuition fees don't exist, and I mean tuition grants don't exist, and you know, there are so many things, you know, the odds are sort of stacked against you, and we just need to remember how we felt when times were actually better. You know, we were scared. So hopefully, you know, it'd be nice that if there was a bit more empathy for you.
Pete, we're running out of time because I'm going to hand over to Hannah in a minute. But can we whip through these questions as quickly as possible? Because I want to make sure. Were there any other? This is from David Everall. Were there any music-related memoirs that influenced your writing?
Yeah, there were a few. I mean, I think I remember reading Giles Smith's Lost in Music years and years ago, and I remember thinking that's probably the book that got closest to what I was kind of hoping to do with my book, because that's that interweaves the kind of music kind of is as much a memoir as it is a celebration of certain records. There were oh yeah, Julian Cope's memoir, Head On, because I just love the kind of slightly gonzoid energy that Julian with which Julian wrote about his early days in The Teardrop Explodes. That I would say that was quite a big influence. I also really liked Simon Goddard's story, Simply Thrilled, Simon Goddard's story about the history of postcard records, which again had that slightly over-caffeinated kind of ridiculous kind of verbosity, but it was actually kind of added to the ramshackle nature. It complemented the ramshackle nature of the music it was describing. I thought that was a very clever thing to do. So those are off the top of my head.
Okay, that's great. So I'm going to read a couple here that's sort of related, and they're about sort of identity. So Sula Green. Hi, I'm a second generation Cypriot, and when younger, I always felt different when I was younger and didn't really know why. I'm a similar age to you, and it's only now that I actually appreciate it and love my story, where I came from, and love my parents' background, which was similar to most Cypriots. Do you feel proud of your heritage and being different? That's one, and I'll just read Lillian's. Lillian Panahi. When did you stop feeling guilty, and how do you see yourself now? British, Cypriot, or a combination of both? How has this affected you in how you've brought up your children?
Combination of both, definitely. And my children, I think my children sort of are proud of, you know, the Greek and Greek Cypriot part. Hang on, I'm just going to let my dog in. There you go. They're very, but I think, yeah, well, I think, yeah, my kids are proud, but I didn't actually teach them Greek as they were growing up, because we were speaking English in the house. Obviously, I married Caitlin, and so it's kind of hard to kind of sort of bring that in. And so, but yeah, no, does that answer the question? Sorry, I think.
Yeah, I think you're saying that I feel that you are proud of your heritage.
I think, you know, everyone just, I think you have to take ownership of your story if possible. You know, it's hard for some people to do that, but you know, your story is unique to you, and you have to sort of take ownership of it. Otherwise,
yeah,
you know, sometimes it's sort of, you can be bitter or whatever, you know, whatever, you know, you've got to sort of I noticed that with my mum, actually, because I interviewed my parents separately before I started writing the book, thinking that might be quite a weird thing to do. And but actually they were quite happy. They were happy, like especially my mum, who's not had the happiest of lives, really. And but the one thing that you have that's unique to you is your story, and it sort of gave it a value to have someone taking an interest in what has happened to you in your life, gives those experiences a value. And so that's important, I think.
Okay, we've got quite a few more. I'm just going to have to go. What's your favourite piece of music? From Zoe Bibonidis.
Hello, Zoe.
And your favourite album of all time. You can only give one album and one piece of music. Okay.
My favourite album of all, probably the album I've listened to most of all time, thinking about it, is I think it might actually be The Wishing Chair by a group called 10,000 Maniacs, which
I love 10,000 Maniacs.
It's I think the lyrics on that are kind of fantastic, and there are certain songs, actually, weirdly enough, that remind me, that kind of resonate with details of my parents' story. There's a song on that album called Maddox Table, which in a weird way reminds me of my mum, and it's a beautiful lyric. It's a lyric basically about someone who spends their whole life in a factory making tables. And I won't bore you with the details now, but listen to Maddox Table. I think that really is. And also, while we're talking about music that kind of somehow inadvertently or deliberately, well, inadvertently chimes with the book, I'd say there's a song by Saint Etienne called Over the Border, which, you know, is so absolutely kind of corresponds to really the motivations. It could be about the book. If you change some of the name, it could be the same story if you change some of the names of the bands and experiences in the book. So so yeah, let's go with Saint Etienne, Over the Border, for favorite piece of music, and 10,000 Maniacs of the Wishing Chair.
Okay, great. Just got I'm sorry if I haven't asked everybody's questions, because I haven't. Helen Barrett from Cyprus, also someone I know well. She wants to know, why Pete wanted to find comfort in pop stars or groups on the TV? Why did you find comfort in pop stars?
I think they were, well, initially, I mean, there's a lot of the book is, you know, a lot of the early section of the book is this obsession I had. My parents, because I wasn't taught, I thought I'd basically failed at being a kind of a good child, because I wasn't speaking, I was causing them embarrassment. So I got it into my head. I thought my parents might be secretly planning to sort of, you know, sort of take me back to the shop, as it were, you know, that I wasn't, you know, that I was defective. And so I started watching Top of the Pops and sort of fantasizing about which singers on Top of the Pops would be good replacement parents for when my parents finally got bored of me. And so certainly that was a factor.
Okay,
so,
thank you.
Yeah,
thank you. Just some other comments. Zoe's saying can't wait for the film, and
I think it looks like it might be a television program, television
Wow.
series.
Wow, that's great. That's great. Well, good luck with that. I'm going to say thank you very much for your time. It's been really interesting. I could talk to you for ages. Probably
well,
ask you.
We must carry this on one day.
Yeah, whenever you want. But now I'm going to have to hand over to Hannah Cooper-Smith, who is a poet and a PhD student in, I think, her final year. And her research is on form in contemporary eco-poetry. Sounds very clever. And her poems engage with themes of nature and connection. She's been published in various journals and is currently working on her first collection. So Hannah, I'm going to mute myself and I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Eve, and thank you, Pete. That was all really fascinating. My research may sound clever, but basically I write a lot of poems about trees, essentially, and you're going to get quite a bit of that today. When I was thinking about what to put together and what to read for this session, I wasn't too sure, to be honest, because I tend to shy away from writing autobiographically. I don't know if it's, maybe in the next 30 years something I'll start to do, but I tend to try and shy away from it. But I was thinking that we kind of instinctively do two things, don't we? We look to the past, we look back and what ought to have happened, as Pete said, and we also try and look forward and we say what's going to happen. And we sort of have this compulsion, don't we, to try and see, what's coming in adulthood. Are we going to make it to the other side of that river, as it were? And lots of my poems, especially recently, have tended toward this idea of what's coming in the future. That being said, the first poem that I'm going to read you is a poem about my childhood. It's about a tree we used to have in the front garden, and my parents had to cut this tree down, unfortunately, and as a child I just didn't understand that. The roots were messing the pavement. It was all, in hindsight I get it. As a child I did not, and so that is what this first poem is about. This is called "And Still the Cypress Remains a Tree of Mourning." The trunk presses against your back, steady as a second spine. You hear what the tree hears, the sound of your mother's call, frantic and fluttering like garden birds. And when they come for the tree, you bind yourself to it with a skipping rope, make a sign of protest, but you are small and easily uprooted, and chalk can be washed away with a hose. The chainsaw makes quick work of that steady trunk, and you feel the injustice of it in your bones, the sheer injustice of it, like a spear to the heart of a sleeping deer, and you think you might die from the weight of knowing that grief has all the power of smoke against stone. So that was sort of, as a child, I didn't understand why trees had to be cut down. I just didn't get it. And to be honest, I still quite don't. The next poem I'm going to read you is about HS2, and not to be too political or anything, but it's about a particular tree that was cut down quite recently, the Covington pear, was in Warwickshire. It was 250 years old, and they cut it down last month, and I wrote this poem a couple of weeks before that happened. So this is the Covington pear. In the green thick of the hedgerow, a wild pear turns suddenly to ghost. The crown of simple leaves blisters white and unreal with silk-slipped flowers, the auspices of fruit, and the old homestead trunk collapses into itself in a singularity of blackbirds, leaves, buds, sap, unravelling caterpillars, spiders ballooning away on their silks, pips spitting nonchalant from mouth to earth, a rush of light and heat and oncoming steel, a sapling just breaking ground. And the crease of the hedgerow is ironed from the map with a fistful of crushed stones, leaving the line of the hill unbroken, perfectly smooth for a swifter passing. I'm going to follow a theme that I started in that last poem, this idea of auspices and looking to the future. I recently, at the beginning of the year, I was very fortunate to be able to be poet in residence at Creswell Crags, which is a heritage site on the border of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. And there's this system of prehistoric caves. And it's a place where I spent a lot of time thinking about our connections to the past and what's coming. Kind of ironically, I had no idea because in March, everything shut down, didn't it? The lockdown happened. So nothing that I could have foreseen there. So this is a poem called The Auspices, which I wrote while I was at Creswell Crags. Two mirthful birds fly overhead, join a third funerary bird, which instantly lifts, turns, splits away to the crag tops to become a solitary sorrow. You await the auspicious fourth, breath held, as the birds cast flittering shadows onto the rock face, squalling their leisure from dark feathered throats. The overhanging trees have become a striated mass, as the sun picks itself out of the leaves, flings itself at the scrying chambers of the eye. The river below blurs to a silver shivering, and the grey-bellied bodies of the birds bloom and spread, and the vicious green of the moss blooms and spreads, and the yellowed ivy blinks and spits out a bird, a single instance of sun-glimpsed feathering, foretelling nothing save the burn of your hands when you come in from the cold. I'm going to follow that with another poem written at Creswell. One thing to note with this is a haruspicy is an ancient method of divination, and it was where they would inspect the entrails of sacrificed animals, especially livers. So something to know there. So this is a pheasant, a haruspicy. Caught in the bank, an obscene, meatless balloon of feathers and bones, red string trailing, beribboned with shards of red and white, a yellow lump of fat, the kind that you might smear, soft, across a glass dish, heat until spitting, then load with chunks of parboiled potato. At the end of the string, one pendant talon, scaled, grey and curling, reaches clear across the path, as though poised to keep running, its plump little body bobbing over soft grass, expecting only to keep running, running as the sun rises, and the trees bloom, and all the little eggs are hatching. I'm just going to do, I think, two more. I'm going to turn back to my trees now. This tree that I'm going to talk about next is it's a tree in London. It's just won the Woodland Trust's Tree of the Year, the Happy Man tree. And unfortunately, it's also due to be felled, I think, later this month, to make way for a admittedly much needed housing development. And unfortunately, this 150-year-old plane tree has been designated for removal. So this is Elegy for the Happy Man. Regard here the happy man, steadily breathing in the heavy air, gathering old smog into the matter of his canopy, his bark. Underfoot his roots compact into a cement cube smaller than a double bed, yet still he thrives, this city tree, spreading wing-like flanks of leaves, broad impressions of green and light against the breathless London sky, blessing the transient heads of the commuters as they pass. Regard here the happy man who once stood proud on the margins of the promenade, busking his heartfelt folksy silence, his wild state to the crowds of Woodbury Down. Bind him with red ribbons and chains of paper flowers, for they will speak as signs of love when the happy man is gone. And I'll just finish off now with a poem actually about my parents and about music. So this perhaps is very apt. In many ways, it is a celebration of my parents. I'm not sure if my dad's actually listening. I think, I'm not sure, but he might be. So if he is, forgive me for the one inaccuracy in the final stanza. School didn't scan as well as cathedral, so sorry. Okay. So this is one other thing to know is that a Gabriel's trumpet is also a plant. It's a plant with these huge yellow flowers, massive ones that you can, if you wanted to, wear as a hat. So this is Gabriel's trumpet. From the trellis, a flourish of trumpets stretch their wide yellow throats, and your head becomes a bucket mute, bright brass tidings burbling in your ear, reminding you that the trumpet is, most bizarrely, the reason you are alive. Your father played it, and your mother played the cornet from the seat beside. And it's funny to think of yourself as a coincidence of plants and metals and sounds, a composition of times, places and songs, Tam O'Shanter's Ride perhaps, or the Margam Stones, the main themes of Star Wars or Rocky, Ravel's Bolero, O Little Town of Bethlehem, played out in the snow by the steps of the Butter Cross. And you wonder if they could hear what glad tidings were heralded in that playing, if they knew that the heart-thudding spaces of the cathedral and the future were ringing, resounding with 3 golden notes. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. That was brilliant and so well read. And people who don't like trees are crazy, as far as I'm concerned. I love trees. Thank you to both of you. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Hannah. I'm going to hand over to Rory now to sort of end the session. I think he's coming on. Is he on? Rory, are you there?
He's right here. I like to be fashionably late and to add suspense to all proceedings. No, thank you, Hannah. That was wonderful. It's lovely to read. I think you're a brilliant writer, and I really enjoyed that, Pete. That was really really interesting. And thanks Eve for chairing the event. Thank you to everyone who's attended. I've added into the chat a couple of things, a note about the hub and what we do, and a link to our forthcoming events. None are yet available to register for. The registration links will go live nearer the time, and if you follow us on Twitter, you'll get notification of those at Hub Nottingham. So thanks very much to everyone. And the next event, by the way, I should mention that, is the poet Alan Jenkins, supported by two of our PhD students, both also excellent poets, Alison Stoneman and Tuesday Shannon. And that's in January. I can't remember exactly when, but if you go on the website, you'll find out towards the end of January. But thank you everyone for attending tonight. And thank you again to our panelists, and goodbye. Take care. Have
I'll stay on anyway if anybody wants to chat to me at the end. I'll stay on.
We'll have this kind of fade out. The class dismissed.
Class dismissed.
Don't want to be dismissed, in which case Eve at least will stay here and turn the lights out before